The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening. On behalf of the Northeast Conference on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, I would like to welcome you to the third in our special webinar series on our 2021 conference theme, Finding Our Voice, World Languages for Social Justice. This evening's webinar is entitled, Finding LGBTQ+ Voices in the World Language Classroom. This webinar has been generously sponsored by Wayside Publishing. Please visit waysidepublishing.com for more information about how Wayside can assist with your remote teaching and learning needs. If you would like to make a donation to help support our work, please visit www.nectful.org/donate. My name is John Carlino, NECTFL Executive Director, and I will be hosting this evening's webinar along with Northeast Conference board members Xiaoyan Hu and Catherine Ritz as moderators. We are grateful to our presenter, Dr. Joseph Parodi-Brown, for offering us his time and expertise. This webinar will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be posted to our website at nectful.org/webinars as soon as it is available. This webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour, with 45 to 50 minutes devoted to the presentation. The remaining time will serve as Q&A with the presenter to answer your questions. Attendees are encouraged to submit questions during the webinar using the question feature of the GoToWebinar control panel on the side of your screen. Our moderators will organize these questions and share them with the presenter as relevant and/or at the end. In the event of technical difficulties, please remain connected as you are able. If the technical difficulties are on your end, please contact GoToMeeting customer support for assistance. If you are having difficulty with sound, click on Phone Call under Audio in the control panel and call in with the number provided. And now, please let me take this opportunity to introduce you to our presenter, Dr. Joseph Parodi-Brown. Dr. Parodi-Brown focuses on teaching for proficiency and engaging language education through the lens of social justice. A teacher for 15 years, he holds bachelor's and master's degrees in Spanish from St. Anselm College, Central Connecticut State University, and Universidad de Salamanca. He received his doctorate from Creighton University with a dissertation on the experiences of LGBTQ+ students in Catholic high schools. Joseph serves on the board of CT COLT and as the secretary of the ACTFL Critical and Social Justice Approaches SIG. Dr. Parodi-Brown, thank you for sharing your time with us. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone for being here this evening. I'm excited to share on this topic with you. And so I just wanted to start by outlining sort of my goals for this evening's webinar, starting with an introduction to myself and the session, briefly covering some of the research about the classroom environment for LGBTQ+ students in the United States, talking a little bit about representation for those students, why that's important, entry points for us to include topics around LGBTQ+ identities in the language classroom, to talk a little bit about language and gender, and then of course to answer questions. And so I wanted to introduce a little bit about myself and my context, because I know one of the questions that I frequently get from world language educators who are looking to engage with this topic in their classrooms are questions about the school environment that they're in, or the community environment they're in. So I'm a teacher at Marionopolis Preparatory School in northeastern Connecticut. It is a small independent Catholic high school. We are co-educational, boarding and day. We have students from over 20 countries on campus. And so certainly there's a wide variety of backgrounds and cultural perspectives on campus. I've taught every level of Spanish that we offer at the school, and became the modern languages department chair about 10 years ago. And one of the things I've been proud of the department in that time is that we've shifted to a curriculum that we don't use a textbook in our school. So we have developed our own curriculum around thematic units and proficiency-based instruction. And I'm the senior class dean as well. So that involves the execution and creation of an advisory curriculum. And part of that involves DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion work as part of our curriculum in our advisory for our students. In August, the head of school announced the creation of our SHIELD program, which stands for Students Honoring Inclusion, Equity, Love, and Diversity. Our mascot is the Golden Knight, so the shield ties into that. And I don't know any Marvel superheroes, but I am in fact the director of SHIELD, so I don't know Samuel L. Jackson, unfortunately. But that's, so in August that was created, and in August the head of school asked me to be the program's first director. So I've been doing some of that work this year as well. And so certainly one of the things the head of school talked to me about when he asked me to take this on is that this work was going to require balancing constituencies with some very different value systems and very different ideas about what inclusion, equity, love, and diversity looks like at our campus, whether the school should be focusing any attention on this program. And so I certainly understand when world language teachers ask me that question, how can I, in this environment, share some of these topics? So, I'm here to say that it can be done, again, even in this Catholic high school, up in, not to put it in political terms, but I do think that's in some ways an important part of this conversation. The town our school is in was recently featured in the Hartford Courant as being the town that went most overwhelmingly for President Trump in the state of Connecticut. So that is an environment that I am teaching in. And I don't say that with any judgment, but when talking about LGBTQ+ issues, I do think it's a relevant topic. I wanted to talk a little bit about my philosophical framework, in which I'm grateful to Uju Anya and LJ Randolph, who wrote an article for the Language Educator, the ACTFL magazine in 2019, diversifying language educators and learners. And they built on the work of Emily Stile and Rudine Sims Bishop, talking about the idea of books and curricula as windows and mirrors, right? We offer in our curriculum a window for students to see the world through, and we offer them a mirror to see themselves reflected. And Dr. Anya and Dr. Randolph added this idea of a sliding glass door, that we want to offer students a sliding glass door that they can walk through and fully immerse themselves and participate in. And so I think as world language educators, if we're thinking about our LGBTQ+ students, we offer, I think, the window very naturally, and oftentimes in our curriculum we offer the sliding glass door. But do we offer a mirror? Are there moments in our curriculum where LGBTQ+ students can see themselves? And so that's sort of one of my frameworks going forward. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the research. As I mentioned, GLSEN, which was formerly known as the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, but which has since changed its name to reflect a more inclusive. So they are now just GLSEN, or GLSEN. One of their projects that they're most noted for is their National School Climate Survey that they've done every 2 years since 1999. So their last climate survey was completed last year in 2019, and the results of that survey were published just last month. And in the 20 years that they've been doing this research, it's very heartening to see the ways that LGBTQ plus students have identified that their school climates have improved over time. In 2017, it was the first year that they did see sort of a plateau and a drop in some of those positive responses, but 2019 did see some of those areas again improve or hold steady. So there were more than 16,000 students from grades 6 through 12 who participated in this survey. They came from all 50 states, from the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, and Guam. And there are a lot of really fascinating numbers and data points to dive into in that survey, and I encourage everyone to visit glscn.org and at least check out the executive summary of the findings. But the numbers I really want to focus on are about classroom experience, about classroom curriculum. And of those students responding, 19.4% of them, so just under 1 in 5 students, said that they were taught any positive representation of LGBTQ plus people or the community or culture in their classrooms. On the other hand, 17.0%, so nearly the same amount, were taught negative content about LGBTQ individuals in their classrooms. And so that is a number that stayed relatively stable from 2017 to 2019. I imagine that in the next version of this survey, we may see some of that first number improve. There are 4 states, so if anyone's here from California or Colorado or Illinois or New Jersey, those are 4 states that have passed laws requiring LGBTQ plus curriculum be taught in schools at different levels. So hopefully we'll see those numbers look up. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about, they asked the students who said that yes, they had heard positive representation in their classroom. They asked them where they heard it. And so they broke it down by discipline. And so, there's a lot to think about in this graph. And so we see the vast majority of students said that they heard positive representation in history or social studies class, by far the number one answer. And, we get down, about, I guess it's 8th or 9th on the list, and we see foreign language. And we'll have to lobby them to call it world languages or something else for us. But, so there it is, about 8.8% of those who said they received positive representation said they heard it in a foreign language class. And then, that results in 1.7% of the total respondents who answered that question. And so we go back to that original number, that 19.4% and that 17%, and then we think about that 8.8%. Now, it's not easy to draw hard conclusions from that. One data point might be to find out what access those students had to world language classes. We know that, we'd like to see more students with access to those classes. And so maybe that's why that number was low. But, we also can see that it is certainly an area of opportunity for world language teachers. That we can put forth better examples of positive representation to our students. And so thinking about ways we can do that, thinking about figures who are speakers of our language of instruction that can be positive representations for our LGBTQ plus students. And then asking ourselves of any individuals to serve as representatives. Are there cultural perspectives that prevent us from knowing these individuals? And how can we address those sorts of things? For example, I think if we think of, the news we have from Russia isn't recently been the best news for LGBTQ plus individuals. And so as a Russian teacher, might that be a concern a member of the LGBTQ plus community who's a student of mine has in my class? And how do we address that, and how do we acknowledge that? This is sort of a rhetorical question for us. But I think certainly as language teachers, many of us have come across cultural perspectives or different practices that we find troubling or concerning or don't match with our cultural perspective, for good or for bad. And how do we address those with our students? So sort of applying that same lens and that same approach for LGBTQ plus issues for our students, because one of the things I found doing my research, interviewing students for my dissertation, is that the silence will be filled by the student with whatever they perceive the silence to represent. And as you can imagine, interviewing students who had graduated from Catholic high schools, for many of them, silence about sexual orientation and gender identity issues was a very present experience for them. And they talked about the ways they filled in that silence themselves. And so certainly our world language students may be doing the same thing in our classes as well. So being aware of how can we acknowledge and offer them those positive representations, or talk about these perspectives or these practices in ways that will affirm and support them. So I talked a little bit about how our curriculum in our modern languages department has switched to thematic units. And one of the things I really love about our program is the parallelism across languages. So students in French 1 see the same units as students in Spanish 1. And this has offered us the opportunity to gather our own resources, to create our own lessons and assessments and all that sort of thing. And so offering our own opportunities to find entry points for broader social justice topics, but also specifically to tonight's conversation, how do we specifically enter the LGBTQ plus conversation in our thematic units? And so there's a lot of different ways to do so. I think generation ago, when language teachers had to be more aware of what vocabulary they taught in the family unit, and recognizing that the ways our students are talking about families are constantly evolving, right? And as a Spanish teacher, and I know this is common across many languages, but this idea of, if a student has dos padres, mis padres, or mis tios, or mis madres, right? What does that mean? What are they trying to communicate? Have they made an error by saying mis madres, or are they in a house with mis madres, my mothers, right? And so cognizance of that. In an assessment about the politics and government unit that we do in the third year, it isn't always an explicit moment. Like, this is a big moment where I am introducing to you vocabulary that is related to LGBTQ plus individuals, or we're having this lesson about anti-homophobia. Sometimes it's more subtle and more implicit than that. So, for example, the assessment I did on this unit, this government and politics unit, and I had to look up the date to see when Stacey Abrams gave the response to President Trump's State of the Union address, and it was 2019. It was just last year, and I was convinced it was like 2-3 years ago. I was shocked when it was 2019, but just last year. So El País, one of the main newspapers of Madrid, wrote about it, and so part of their assessment included an interpretive reading assessment, about that article, and one of the questions was, name two of the, 3 main ideas that Stacey Abrams said represented the Democratic Party. And LGBT rights was one of them. They didn't have to, there were more options than they had to provide, so they could choose not to use that in their answer if they wanted, if they were that intentional about it. If they were just picking the first 2 that they came across, they would have used it. But it uses colectivo LGBT, LGBT community in Spanish. It used that language in context, and so it offered the students an authentic way of seeing that language printed. Whether they would continue to use it or not, that's sort of the idea of proficiency, right? Letting them focus on the language that's most pertinent to them. And so we can think of in all of our languages probably the ways that we can either introduce individuals who are members of the LGBTQ plus community that can tie into these areas. If we're in AP Spanish literature and we're teaching about Lorca, and we're teaching about the ways marginalization manifests in his work, and not addressing that he himself was a member of a marginalized community, that's a really missed opportunity. And so tying these figures into these different units can be really, really important. And representation certainly is not the only answer. And I think for a lot of us, representation, we sort of consider to be step 1, and there needs to be a step 2 and a step 3. But if we go back to that 19.4%, that representation is a big step for 4 out of 5 LGBTQ plus students in our country. And so, again, these are, just different resources that I was able to find with my rudimentary language skills and Google, right? But, this is now a quick infographic about, countries where marriage equality is law, where civil unions are law, but not marriage equality, and where there is no legal union for same-sex couples. And so this is in Italian, and this can be, it's a novice, accessible, authentic resource. Again, so if we're talking about family, right? If we're talking about adoption in families, and again, this quick little paragraph about adoption law for heterosexual or homosexual couples, and how how that is evolving. Here, another infographic about different legal views of homosexuality, of marriage equality, etc. Again, in French. This from the French government, right? So now we've got the official governing body of the French Republic saying that the rights of the LGBTQ plus community are human rights, right? We talk here about gendered language and in the rights of man is opposed to human rights, and what that means, is a conversation as well, but a slightly separate one. Right, we have the opportunity to talk about intersectionality with our students. We know that the experience of being a refugee, of being an immigrant, and the experience of being LGBT can be two identities whose intersectionality rate opens up individuals to bigger challenges. We can talk about athletes and homophobia in sports, or is homophobia getting out of sports, and all that sort of thing. So this is a Bundesliga player who came out after he left the Bundesliga, I believe, but is now, I think, a manager for one of the teams. I'm a La Liga guy, so I don't follow Bundesliga as much. FC Barcelona all the way for me. And that certainly is a good point to, if anyone's got any questions, I'd be happy to answer anything that may have come up.
Hi, Joseph. So there's been really nice comments have come through just to start us off. Somebody commented they love the SHIELD acronym at your school, the image of, or the concept of the sliding glass door. Teresa Nassari commented that she's read the article in El País that you just mentioned, so that was exciting, and people are really loving some of the specific examples. Two quick questions that came up. So Diana Zuckerman was wondering, the data that you shared previously about representation in different content areas, just curious if perhaps the world language number was so low because less students are enrolled in world languages. So was just curious whether that had any impact on the data.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, and I apologize for not being clearer about that. It isn't clear from the reporting from the climate survey if that was even asked. My sense is that that lower enrollment in world language classes is partially responsible for that lower number. I mean, we know that our students have to be enrolled in English, and most students are enrolled in history, but across the country we know that world language requirements are vastly different, and access is not always as equitable as we would like. So I think that's definitely a factor, and it's one of the dangers of drawing too quick a conclusion from numbers that we think don't lie, but often can be misleading. So it's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then people are commenting how much they love all the examples of the different authentic resources. I love also that you showed at different proficiency levels, which was nice to think about how this can be integrated at all levels. There was another quick question from Robin Hughes on more examples in music and television. So I imagine you also have examples there. I don't know if you wouldn't mind elaborating a little bit on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, thank you for the question. And certainly I'm happy to, my contact information will be at the end as well. So I certainly welcome these conversations with everyone, going forward as well. And so I'm sorry, music and
television. Sorry.
Television. Yeah, well, certainly I think, and again, I'm going to speak from, as a Spanish teacher, that's the community I'm most familiar with. But we know that we have plenty of examples of individuals who are involved in these fields. So as we're looking to lift up different identities as we address different topics, right? So as I'm doing a music unit with my students, and I'm talking about Celia Cruz, I'm talking about her identity as an Afro-Cuban woman. Similarly, I might talk about Ricky Martin and talk about his identity as a gay man and his family, and how that has propelled him to be a vocal activist in many different fields, not just LGBTQ plus rights. If it's not a truly, it's not a Spanish language example, but if any of you watched Netflix's reboot of One Day at a Time, they do a lot of great work talking about LGBTQ plus issues in the context of a Cuban American family. And so certainly there are plenty of examples out there, and happy to share any thoughts I have with individuals at any time.
Perfect, thank you. Some of the other questions that came in, I know you're going to be touching on as you move forward with the presentation, so I'll save those for the end. But please feel free, everyone, to post a question if you have one, and they come directly to us, and then I can relay them or comments to our presenter.
Great, yeah, thank you very much, Catherine. And yeah, so as I've sort of alluded to, right, in most of the languages that we teach, gender is really ingrained in the languages. And so we know that language and gender can pose a real challenge for language teachers. And honestly, that was a very teacher-centric way of posing it. It can really challenge our language students to find ways to express themselves. We're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about the potential conflicts that exist as we dive into this topic, and emerging solutions and other opinions that go along with them. Right. So LGB language itself is fairly straightforward. In many languages, they're using loan words or cognates to describe members of the LGB community. And so we have a framework for talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual individuals, right? We can understand that a student saying mis padres may be talking about mi padre and mi madre, but he might be talking about mis padres, his two fathers, right? And so the language there exists. And even if we have students who identify as transgender female, or as transgender male, that's pretty straightforward-ish, right? If a student tells me that they identify or they are a transgender female, then I'm going to use female adjectives and female pronouns when I'm speaking with them. But where we really run into some issues is when we have students in front of us who say, I identify as non-binary. I don't identify as male or female. This is very real for our community. We have a student who is non-binary, who you can imagine coming into a Catholic school, you know, there had to be some cultural shifts for us across the board, and you know, it quickly became, it quickly shifted the way that we approached instruction in our language department, and so you know, I almost feel shame on us that we responded and we weren't proactive about it. But the good news is that we're there now, and so one of the things we talked about is that we would introduce non-binary options to our students at all levels and languages, regardless of whether or not there was an out transgender or non-binary student in that class, right? We wanted this not to be about one student or several students, but we wanted all students to know these options, and you know, to help students see themselves in the language. But of course, the you know, for many of us, right, the endings cause problems and the pronouns cause problems, and you know, so we're a little bit later on, we're going to talk about some of the ways that communities who speak these languages are trying to address them. And you can see here this tweet that I pulled and screenshotted, you know, with some examples in French. And so we will talk more about that later as well. And, you know, this isn't without challenges in our world language teaching community, and in the linguistic community as a whole. Right, it's important to remember that language evolves, but language, like all evolution, occurs slowly, right? It doesn't happen overnight. And that when we see detractors or people who are pushing back on some of this language or some of these ideas, that it's not unique to any one language. Just as English speakers, there are English speakers who are resistant to they as a singular pronoun. We know that these detractors or these opponents of such language are going to exist in any language. And so whether it's the Académie Française or La Crusca in Italian or La Real Academia Española, you know, we know that I know that I don't have to look the Real Academia Española in the eye and justify using these unaccepted or non-standard endings or pronouns. But I would have to look a student in the eye and tell them that I couldn't use this because the Real Academia says it's not. And so that's where I am on that. And these, you know, these detractors come from all different areas and have power within our languages. There's a clip I found of Mario Vargas Llosa being interviewed at the Miami Book Fair about inclusive language, and he laughs at the question, and he says, you know, language is a natural thing, and to denaturalize it in this way is a dangerous thing. And, you know, who am I to argue with a Nobel laureate? But it seemed to me that he was contradicting his own argument, that speakers of languages are seeing the need for changes in the language and are adapting the language. And if that's not how language changes and evolves, I'm not entirely sure how it happens. Another criticism of some of these ideas is that of linguistic colonization, that students and teachers or activists from the United States are exporting their value system on languages that aren't their own. And full disclosure, Spanish is my L2. I am not a native or heritage Spanish speaker. So I come from that perspective. But that criticism doesn't hold a lot of weight with me for a couple of reasons. I think, and I'm not the first to point this out, but it discounts, for example, the large number of Spanish L1 speakers in the United States. And I think erasing their input into the conversation is damaging. And the second is that these conversations are happening, again, I'm speaking about Spanish because it's the language I'm most comfortable with, and because it tends to hold the most bandwidth in the United States for a couple of reasons, one of which I'll get to. But these conversations are occurring in Spanish-speaking countries, aside from the United States. We see a huge movement out of Argentina. And you can find, there's a video, for example, of a young girl who's being interviewed by her local news channel about, she's out protesting in front of the Capitol, and she's speaking with a reporter, and she's using gender neutral language to talk about the diputados, the representatives, and the anchor, back in the studio, starts berating her about the Spanish she's using, and that she's not speaking Spanish correctly, and she shouldn't be using this language. And she's like, she's a 16-year-old girl, and it's really not a good look for this anchor, you know. But this is something that is organic and occurring in the country. There's a fantastic video of a very young girl explaining to her mother why she kept getting in trouble for using gender-neutral language, and it's a great video to watch as well, because it is a beautiful example of that Argentinian accent in this little girl as well. There's a Sprite ad that aired in Argentina during Pride, and so we know that these aren't isolated conversations that are coming out of the United States. There's a great TikTok video of a non-binary individual who's talking about how the embassy, the consulate in New York City, addressed a letter to them, estimade Senore Brown, and estimade with an X, Senore with an E at the end. And he said, this came from the Spanish government and was inclusive language for non-binary individuals. So those arguments of linguistic colonization, it's a long way of me saying that I have a hard time with them. And I think a lot of times they get sort of conflated with the term Latinx being used in English. And I think in some ways they are two separate issues. And so I'm not going to get too much into that, but I think that's one of the reasons that this idea of linguistic colonization becomes really ingrained in people who are hesitant to hear these changes. And another conflict is that because of the organic nature that these changes are happening, languages aren't finding one standard solution. We see this in English as well. They seems to be the most popular non-binary pronoun, but there are others. Z and Zir, for example, is just off the top of my head is one I know. And so we're seeing in these other languages as well that they're not just coming up with one, they're coming up with several. And so here are some emerging solutions that are coming out of these languages. And I don't necessarily know a ton about all of these languages to talk in a super expert level about them, but I did want to offer examples in more than one language, right? And so in Arabic, I guess there's a gender neutral dual form that largely doesn't exist in casual spoken Arabic much anymore, but some communities are adapting that to avoid gender specification. On that tweet we saw a couple of slides ago, we saw, and apologies, I'm not sure if I would be pronouncing it right, but Yil, which combines both the masculine and feminine pronouns into a new pronoun. But even in that tweet we saw there were others, ul, al, ol. And in terms of adjective endings, there's been some use of a median period, which is not without problems or concerns as well. In German, they're looking at ways to, German has as I understand it, a neutral gender for objects already. And so there are some ways that German is looking to prioritize those. There's something called the Hebrew non-binary project to look at ways to include that. I saw an example, that changed the ending. It was at a camp, and they had 3 different words for camper, masculine, feminine, and gender neutral or non-binary. Italian is a language that I was finding some of the least information about. The information I did seem to find was this use of you as an adjective ending or as a noun ending where nouns are gendered, and elu as a pronoun. Again, Portuguese has a couple options, elu, ele, el, that are all related to the gendered pronouns, but separate from them. And Spanish, the arroba, the @sign. The problem with that is that it doesn't really reflect a non-binary identity. It reflects a joining of identity of the O and the A. It's also not super pronounceable. X is, you are seeing the X in Spanish in some ways. As I mentioned, that TikTok video mentioned the use of the X. Generally, when I've heard it in Spanish pronounced, I've heard it pronounced as an E sound. And so, as we said in that video, estimade, with an X as replacing the final vowel. But the E seems to be the most common solution that's coming up in Spanish, partially because it's the most pronounceable, partially because E exists as an ending already for adjectives and nouns, and doesn't reflect a gender. And then lay and lace would be gender neutral definite articles. Une, unes would be indefinite articles, and eye would be a pronoun. I'm happy to, again, as I said, I don't know a ton about the other languages as much, but that is, yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions that I can about any of this. And so that is the end of my presentation, and happy to answer any questions that like I said, that I can. And if I don't know the answer to, I'm happy to follow up with you later.
Well, Joseph, thank you so much. So once again, some really nice comments. People have lots of questions on the gender or the non-binary pronouns, as you may have anticipated.
Sure.
One quick clarification, which I echo as a French teacher. If you go back a slide, what is the median period in French?
So my understanding is that if you've got an adjective or a gendered noun, you sort of combine both endings with like a dot in the middle, essentially. So, Catherine, I don't know if you could give an example of like a gendered noun or adjective.
German does something similar with a slash. They put the feminine ending on first and then a slash and then the masculine ending, or maybe it was the other way around. But it makes some things very awkward, but the intent is clear, is to include both the feminine and the masculine. And I don't think that came from a desire to be gender neutral, more to be inclusive of both, feminine and masculine, but different place, but similar concept.
Great, and someone has just added an example in the question, intelligent, and then .e. Question on that. So lots of the other questions related, I think you've touched on. So the questions from an Arabic teacher, and just related to, when languages might be slow or cultures may be slow to incorporate these. So sort of how do we approach this? So I'm just going to throw a couple questions at you, and then I'll let you, because they're all related to the same topic. In the Latinx community, these might not be, some of these terms maybe, or Latinx itself may be controversial in certain communities. So some advice on that. Another person commented that in French class, they explained to students that the gender is a grammatical gender and not necessarily related to your own personal gender. So some just thoughts on your approach with that. And then a last question I'll throw at you related to this. If we're teaching this inclusive language in our classes, but it's not being used in other countries when students may travel there, so sort of how might we negotiate that?
Great, yeah. So absolutely, a lot to unpack there. So I guess, so the first question I think had to do with languages that may be slower to evolve on this, right? And I think this is a really interesting cultural perspective, right? For example, with the influence of the Catholic Church in Italy, I'm not surprised that Italian may not be progressing as quickly on some of these issues as other languages. And so I think framing it in that way is really important. Framing it in a way and pointing out, as we're right, products, practices, and perspectives, right? The product is the language, the practice is developing the language or using the language, and then the perspective is really the underlying belief there. And I think what's clear is that we're able to say to students that there are communities in just about all of these languages that we're studying that are working on this, right? That are trying to identify themselves in their own language. And I think just being open to the student saying, I don't know, I'm going to keep looking for anything I can find, is really the best for that. Yeah, there was a question or a comment / question about grammatical gender as opposed to personal gender. I am of the mind that it doesn't necessarily need to be grammatical gender either. Because we know that these classifications don't make any logical sense in any sense of in terms of what gender is, and that it can be really confusing to our students in a lot of ways, right? I think I've given the example before of chair, right? In Italian and French and Spanish, it's a feminine word. In German, I'm pretty sure it's a masculine word, and I think in Russian as well. And why? Well, nothing because nothing having to do with the chair, right? So one of the things I've started using in class is L words and law words, and you can talk about them in the same way, but I find masculine and feminine tends to be confusing to students and not necessarily particularly helpful. So talking about L words and law words is something I do in the Spanish classroom. What else? What did I miss?
Last quick question on the pronouns. There was a question regarding Spanish. What about the direct object pronoun lo/la? Is that lay? I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. le/les?
Yeah, exactly. Lay or lays. Yeah, exactly. Lay ends up doing a lot of work for a lot of non-binary individuals in Spanish, and it, like so many things, it comes down to the context, right? Lay can be a definite article, you know, but it's right there in front of a noun, and from the basis of the sentence, you would be able to understand if the lay was an indirect or a direct object pronoun.
So there were a couple questions just generally about resources. So where can we go to find resources on pronouns, on some of the earlier things you talked about, sort of approaches to integrate this topic more effectively in our classes? So are there some places you could point us to?
Yeah, definitely. And again, feel free to reach out as well afterward. Oops, I did not want to do that. Yeah, so in terms of, one of the things I do is look for the places you might look for authentic resources for anything, right? Search for Instagram posts or Twitter posts or Facebook posts using the word for non-binary in your language, if that's what you're trying to find, or you know, going into any of these, you know, in Twitter and search, you know, you can search by language and you can search then a keyword and find that. In terms of you know, organizations as well in your target language countries, right? So there are, in Quebec, there are some LGBTQ plus groups in Spain and in Italy and in a lot of these different countries. So you know, starting, you know, start on Wikipedia, right? I mean, you can find a lot of resources there because it gives you the opportunity to see what sources they've cited. You know, you can search, you know, you can probably search like French LGBTQ plus celebrities or things like that in terms of just people to put in front of your students as well. So yeah, the internet is definitely your friend on this, as am I. So please do reach out.
Wonderful. And I know we're coming close on time, so just very briefly, there were a couple questions regarding pushback, either from parents, obviously you're teaching in a Catholic school, but just general, if you've encountered that, if you might just comment on that briefly before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think like everything, it's important to know our communities and to sort of know what the balancing point is, what sort of like that flashpoint is. I, for 3 years now, have been introducing in the way I speak to students and mentioning to them non-binary endings and pronouns, and I haven't had an issue. I haven't had a student who's gone home and complained, and the school has complained, or if they have, I haven't heard about it. But yeah, I mean, I think that's really it, and sort of validating the concern in a way, validating what you're trying to do in a way that isn't dismissive of others' feelings or beliefs. I think is just that balance that that we do as teachers all the time, that I see in Facebook groups about observing Dia de los Muertos in class or things like that, right? Always a balancing.
Awesome. Well, it's encouraging that you haven't really experienced feedback. Well, thank you so much. I know there were some other questions we didn't get to, but thank you for generously providing your contact information. So if anyone needed to follow up. And now I'm going to pass it back to John for some closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Joseph, for that very informative presentation, and thank you, Catherine and Xiaoyan, for moderating. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, it has been recorded, and the recording will be made available on our website tomorrow. If you would like to make a contribution to help support our webinar series, please visit nectfl.org/donate. New York State teachers who need proof of attendance for CTLE credit, please use the links provided on our website on the webinars page. Teachers in other states may use the same links, but please consult your local district and/or state regulations regarding documenting PD hours. On behalf of the Northeast Conference Board of Directors, thank you for attending this evening's webinar. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Goodbye, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.